Lord, take our eyes and see through them. Take our ears and hear through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and fill them with your fire. Amen. Please be seated. You all have heard the expression, we're all in the same boat. Of course, it means that we are in the same unpleasant situation as other people. The disciples on the sea were in the same boat. They were storm-tossed and afraid, not sure they'd make it to morning's light. I've heard a lot of people use the term we're all in the same boat about the pandemic that we're dealing with. It's been affecting every country. A lot of businesses are hurting. The illness can affect all different ages. Usually people use the expression to help engender compassion for one another. Since we're all in the same boat, we might as well work together. 19th century British theologian G.K. Chesterfield once said, "We're all in the same boat on a stormy sea, and we owe each other a terrible loyalty." But there's another similar phrase that I feel is a little bit more accurate. We're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. I recently saw this phrase attached to an image that showed a raging sea and lightning and waves and rain and wind, and in the water were several different kinds of boats. A battleship, a big yacht, a sailboat, a rowboat, a little life raft. Your experience of the storm would be a lot different depending on what kind of boat you were in, wouldn't it? I think we can look at the world today and all the issues that we're dealing with and see that we may all be experiencing the same storms, but many of us are in different boats. For example, it's so lovely for me to finally be able to worship, for us to finally be able to worship together again, for me to be here in front of you, to actually see faces, even if they're masked faces, instead of preaching into an iPhone. It makes a big difference. But how we've dealt with this time apart really depends on what kind of boat you've been in. For people like me, during this time of isolation and pandemic, I admit I've been in a pretty comfy boat, maybe even a yacht. I live in a nice house. I have a husband who works from home. We get to have his kids every other week. I've been able to come into the office when I want, and here I have fellow staff and parishioner volunteers I can talk with, at least from a 6-foot apart distance. All my loved ones are healthy, and while keeping all the safety protocols, I have been able to get out and do the business I need to do. It's not been all easy, but overall, there have been bright sides to this storm of the pandemic for me. But for others, the effects of the COVID storm have been harder to navigate. If you're single or unable to get out much, isolation can lead to depression and loneliness. Many seniors living in facilities haven't been able to be with their family for months, and we're so glad some of them are here today. Some people have had to put off needed medical procedures, and plenty of workers haven't had the option to work from home, while still others are unemployed or have seen their businesses lose money. And heaven help those who don't have a home at all to quarantine in. Same storm, different boats. We could apply that same saying to other issues going on in the world today. The political tensions and the racial tensions of this country are storming around us. The various boats we are in affect how we experience these things. What kind of boat are you in? A boat built by privilege, education, and resources? Or a boat that has been pounded by storm after storm of prejudice and lack of opportunity? Your perspective and mine might be very different depending on what kind of boat we find ourselves in. We might even differ in how we understand the storm. Are these strong winds pushing us to new shores, leading us to positive change? Or do the gales threaten to break apart our only means of navigating the waters we know? Same storm, different boats. I guess another aspect we could consider is this: do we get to choose our boats, or do our boats choose us? I think both are true to some extent. I guess we could ask the same about the storm. I certainly know that some people have had to deal with storms much bigger in their lives than I have. But I think the key aspect here is that in this life, God never promised us clear sailing. We all have storms. Sometimes, like in the story of Elijah in the cave and Jesus sending his disciples ahead in the boat, it seems that God actually purposefully sends us out knowing we will encounter a storm. How we experience those storms and handle those storms has to do with what kind of boat we're in and what kind of boat we choose. Some aspects of our boat are just handed to us by the circumstances of life or the structures of society. Other aspects we have a choice in. I think the words of the Serenity Prayer fit here. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So let's get back to our biblical text for today. In our Old Testament lesson, Elijah has just confronted King Ahab and defeated the prophets of Baal. It was a fantastic display of God's power. Elijah called down fire from heaven and everything. But King Ahab's wife, Jezebel, is none too happy and has vowed to have Elijah put to death. So Elijah is scared and he's fleeing for his life. The storm that Elijah faces is the ungodly, corrupt rulers leading Israel astray and who are set against him and against God's ways and God's will. It was a storm that was faced by the other Israelites as well. On top of that, there is drought and famine in the land. Elijah cries out to God, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life." But God sustains him with miraculous food and drink in the desert, and in that strength he travels 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. This is where our passage begins. The word of God comes to Elijah and asks, "What are you doing here?" A question he will ask Elijah twice. So maybe Elijah hadn't been following God's navigational chart in the first place to end up at Mount Horeb. Elijah begins with his lament again. "I've been zealous for you, God, but all the Israelites have rejected you. I'm the only one left, and my life is on the line." It sounds like he thinks he's the only one experiencing the storm, and that he's all alone in the boat. Elijah finds the baggage of fear and anxiety in his boat, perhaps even depression. He looks for the voice of God in the storms on the mountain, in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, but God is not there. He can't hear God's voice until there's a still, small voice, a sound of sheer silence. Yes, there is a storm in Israel, God says, but God has a plan. God assures Elijah that he's not the only one out in this stormy sea, that there are 7,000 others who will carry on the fight. The same storm looks a lot different when you know that you're part of a whole fleet and not just a lone boat tossed on the waves. The boat fueled by faith and solidarity is a lot better than the boat of fear and isolation. The story we have in the gospel today falls right on the heels of the story that we heard last week, the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember, Jesus had been trying to find a solitary place to pray after the death of John the Baptist, but was met by the crowds. And in his compassion, he healed them and fed them all with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. Finally, at the end of the day, he sent the disciples away in a boat while he dismissed the crowds. Jesus finally took the solitary prayer time that he needed. I think Jesus knew that his disciples would be encountering a storm. In the evening, the boat was already far from shore and buffeted by the wind, but Jesus does not go to them until the 4th watch of the night, between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Jesus must have known they'd be frightened, but he also was clear on what he himself was called to do, to recenter himself in prayer and in his Father's will. I believe God knows that dealing with adversity and the storms of life can open us up to an encounter with him. Dealing with storms helps us learn and build on our strength. I don't believe God causes the storms in our life, but God doesn't always prevent them either. There's a contemporary Christian song called "Sometimes He Calms the Storm." The chorus goes like this: Sometimes he calms the storm with a whispered, "Peace, be still." He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close and lets the wind and waves go wild. Sometimes he calms the storm, and other times he calms his child. How are the disciples experiencing this storm? What kind of boat are they in? It's been a long and confusing day, and now they've been compelled by Jesus to get in their small fishing boat and go on ahead. As the wind and the waves pick up, they find themselves in a boat of fear and anxiety, which just added to their exhaustion and confusion. Were they angry that Jesus wasn't with them? Angry that he seemed to have abandoned them? Maybe. But they're also obedient. Jesus had told them to go to the other side. It would have been easier to turn around and go back to shore, but if they had been disobedient, they would have missed what Jesus was doing in the midst of the storm. At the right time, Jesus does come to them, miraculously, walking on the water. God's timing is often different than ours. And when Jesus comes, the disciples don't recognize him at first. One of our constant refrains when we are battling the storms of life needs to be, "Where are you, Lord?" And to keep looking out for how Jesus comes to us. Jesus responds with words of comfort, power, and assurance. "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Have courage, I am, fear not." In saying "it is I," the ego and me in Greek, he's using the very name of God, Yahweh. I am who I am. Fear not, God is God. Peter is ready to accept this, and at Jesus' invitation steps out of the boat of fear and into the waves of faith. He doesn't make it long before he falters, but he shows us just what the power of Jesus can do. And then when Jesus gets in the boat, the storm is calm for all of them. Finally, all of their eyes are opened and they proclaim, "Truly, you are the Son of God." In this world, there are storms. The kind of boat we have can make a difference in how we handle those storms. Same storm, different boats. Some boats we may not get to choose, which means we need to refrain from judging other people's boats and to be ready to help out those who are in vessels that are less seaworthy than ours. We do have some say in how we equip our boats and what passengers and cargo we take along with us. Do we load ourselves down with baggage like self-pity, fear, self-interest, or anxiety? Or can we trust that God is God and decide to weather the storms with faith, centeredness, and hope? We are called to follow God's leading in obedience, even if it leads us into scary storms. We are called to look out for Jesus on the waves and be ready to meet him when he calls. And always, we are called to invite him into our boats, where we can see and find his peace and his power. A boat with Jesus on board can weather any storm.